I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. In Congress, we have obviously chief jurisdiction on the federal government, the EPA. We have a more limited role by the very nature of tax dollars and accountability at the state level. There's still a role, but nevertheless, it's still less. Our focus many times on the federal component is one primarily of jurisdiction, dollars, power of the purse. That's why I feel so adamantly about it. It is not to excuse what happened at the city or at the state level, but the remedy on how to deal with this often is at the city, county, or state level. Now, we will still look at those things, and clearly there is no doubt in anybody's mind that there were dramatic failures at the city level, at the state level, and there is a complete case to be made about the need to look at what happened between that state emergency manager, the governor's office, the Michigan Environmental Quality. I understand that. But a lot of our focus will naturally be upon the EPA because of the nature of it being a federal entity and this being the United States Congress. With that said, we've had something festering at the EPA for a long period of time. And often where there's smoke, there's a bigger fire. Remember, it was Gina McCarthy, the EPA now administrator, who was overseeing a guy named John Beal, who was dealing with air quality. It's one of the few times the administration actually prosecuted, and he had to serve time in jail for fraud. She got a promotion. Now she's in charge of the EPA. Here's my question, and Mr. Beauvais, and this is my frustration. You said that it's a high priority, but what evidence do you support to us, or can you give to us, that this is a high priority for the EPA? In July of last year, we highlighted the problems in Region 5. We talked about Susan Hedman. We talked about the sexual misconduct. We had 3 people who stepped up and said, we've got a problem here. Was anything done about that you're aware of?
I'm not privy to personnel discussions and matters.
Nothing.
EPA 5.
She just retired. No consequence on Monday. And so my point is, when we have these discussions in hearing, and you've got 3 whistleblowers, good, hard, decent, working, patriotic people saying, we got a problem here. You have sexual misconduct. You have retaliation. Guess what? It bleeds over. And so then you have a good person like Mr. Del Toro who steps up. What's the lesson that is learned?
I actually think that Mr. Del Toro is representative of the vast majority of EPA employees who are incredibly dedicated.
But you're here testifying that it's a high priority. He brings that up. He went to her house in February, correct? And it isn't until January of the following year. It took a year from the time he first showed up at Ms. Walters' home till the EPA actually issued a directive, correct?
EPA was working with MDEQ to try to get them to do the right thing. Ultimately,
they were suppressing those reports. They were telling they were preliminary. Mr. Edwards, what did you see as you looked at those documents? Were they trying to do that, or were they trying to suppress the evidence?
EPA was aiding, abetting, and emboldening MDEQ's cover-up of this problem.
How do you respond to that?
I think that the specific facts of those matters ought to be looked at by the IG.
We're looking at them right here today.
I understand.
You're in charge of water quality. He's telling you that they aided and abetted the making sure that information didn't get out. Why?
My understanding is that they were working with MDEQ to try to get action taken on the issues.
That's not what the evidence shows. That's not what those documents show. They kept saying that they were preliminary. You should rely on that data. Don't look at that data. Is that correct, Mr. Edwards?
That's absolutely correct.
What's your response to that?
I can't speak to the specific statements that were made in those communications. My understanding is that EPA was working closely with MDEQ to try to get them to do the right thing, that in July they agreed that corrosion control needed to be applied, that in August they sent a letter to the city saying that corrosion control should be applied,
let's
and
talk,
that the city announced in September that corrosion control would be applied.
Let's talk about the right thing to do. What's the number one thing you do? If you're trying to warn the citizens, let the citizens know, what's the number one thing you should let them know?
I think that that's exactly the right question to ask.
I'm asking you the question, and I'm glad you agree it's the exact right question. You're from the EPA, you're in charge of water quality, I want to know what the answer is.
It's important for EPA to go back and understand all the
No,
facts.
it's not. No, it's not. It's important for the EPA to tell the public that they're poisoning their kids if they drink the water.
I absolutely agree. And
Then why didn't they do it? They sat on that for almost a year.
Administrator McCarthy issued an elevation policy this January emphasizing...
This January, they had it for nearly a year. The EPA administrator went to Flint yesterday. EPA first went to her home in February of last year. Why did it take a year?
I can't answer that question. All I can say is that they were working with...
Then why don't we fire the whole lot of them? What good is the EPA if they're not going to do that? If you're not going to tell the citizens, my daughter, okay, she's getting married. I'll get emotional about that. She's moving to Michigan. Are you telling me that the EPA, knowing that they're putting lead in the water, there's lead in the water, that they're not going to tell those kids? Because that's exactly what happened. They knew that. Mr. Del Toro knew that, didn't he? When did he know that?
Mr. Del Toro did testing on Ms. Walters' water in early 2015 and knew that the lead levels were incredibly high in her water.
When was that?
I believe that it was in February 2015.
Yes. Why wasn't that made public?
I don't know the answer to that question. I think that the...
You can't come to a hearing before Congress and be in charge of water quality for the EPA and not know the answer to that question. You can't. You can't know. You've got to know why that is. And don't tell me that some inspector general is going to come look at that. That ain't good enough. We keep hearing that. That ain't good enough. The crying shame here is when they knew there was a problem, they should have told the public. They should have told DEQ. They should have told the experts, and they should have been out there to warn people like Ms. Walters. General Motors knew about this and stopped using the water, for goodness sake. But you know what? The families don't have the resources that General Motors does. Mr. Edwards, when do you think they knew, and when should they have actually made that public?
I think they should have made it public as soon as Ms. Walters figured out that her child was lead poisoned and they were not following the federal law. But even if you excuse that, when Mr. Del Toro put his professional career on the line to have that memo written and gave it to Leanne, when they started covering it up at that point, I really personally believe it was criminal.
And that's why we will continue to investigate this. One other thing, and I appreciate the generosity of the time. Why has the EPA failed to fulfill the FOIA request? This committee has jurisdiction on FOIA. We've done a reform package that Mr. Cummings was very involved with. When Mr. Edwards, he works for his life on studying water. We need good people like Mr. Edwards to be able to access the data and the information at the EPA. Why can't we fulfill these FOIA requests? Because you're supposed to do it in 21 days, as Mr. Meadows pointed out, and it's been 9 years. When is he going to get that information?
I don't know the specifics with regard to the FOIA requests, but as I said before, I will take this back and ensure that it's a high priority.
I think that's a fair answer for this question. I appreciate the EPA responding to us on that regard in a timely manner. But we have to know the answer to that question. You can't play hide the documents. Here, I've gone way past my time. We have other members that need to ask questions. So let me yield back and now go to Mr. Clay for 5 minutes.